Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Weisberg. I am the CEO of the Federation for Jewish Philanthropy of Upper Fairfield County. And I'm really pleased today to introduce, to welcome you to another in a continuing series of webinars that we've been offering over the past couple of months. And this one entitled Discovering a Yiddish Treasure Trove, How a Nazi-Era Paper Brigade led by Jews rescued key artifacts to preserve our history. We're hosting you from the Federation for Jewish Philanthropy of Upper Fairfield County. And what that typically means when we do a webinar is that we see folks from our Upper Fairfield County neighborhoods, and we see folks register from places like Bridgeport and Fairfield and Norwalk and Westport and Ridgefield. And as we saw the registration start coming in for this particular webinar with this very special guest, Jonathan Brent, what was interesting to me was once again, I saw registrants from places like Fairfield and Bridgeport and Westport and Norwalk. And then I began to see registrants from places like New York and New Jersey and Florida and California. And then I started seeing registrants from places like London and South Africa and Lithuania. And so it is unusual for us to have such a global audience for our webinars. So I'd like to welcome all of you to my Upper Fairfield County living room. And what's clear to me is that folks from around the world are not all tuning in to listen to me, but they're all tuning in because of the very special guest that we have, Jonathan Brent. I just want to introduce Jonathan to you by reading you a bit about his bio. Jonathan Brent is a historian, publisher, translator, writer, and teacher. For 18 years, he was editorial director at Yale University Press, where he established the Annals of Communism series. His books include Stalin's Last Crime and Inside the Stalin Archives. Jonathan has translated poems of Joseph Brodsky and Vladimir Mayakovsky and teaches history and literature at Bard College. He is currently writing a biographical study of the Russian writer Isaac Babel and is finishing a novel. In 2009, Jonathan became executive director and CEO of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, where he initiated the Edward Blank YIVO Vilna Online Collections project to conserve and digitize all of YIVO's pre-World War II collections. Jonathan lectures widely on Jewish, Soviet, and East European history. He has made 3 documentaries about his work: Stalin's Last Plot, Stalin, Man of Steel, and Declassified Stalin. And he's now participating in a documentary on the life and disappearance of Raoul Wallenberg. His books have been translated into French, Swedish, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, and Polish. But if it's okay with you, Jonathan, we're gonna stick with English for this webinar. I'm pleased to welcome Jonathan Brent. Jonathan, welcome. Thanks so much for making time for us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, a lot of folks who are tuning in may be familiar with YIVO, but for those who aren't, for starters, just a little bit on what is YIVO? What does it do? When did it start? What's the differences between what it did when it started and what it's doing now?
YIVO started as an idea in 1925, an idea of various scholars Jewish scholars who were from the Russian Empire. And they were, for the most part, transplants from Moscow, Petersburg, and other places. And they came to Berlin in 1925 because they could see very clearly that the Jewish world was undergoing radical transformation. World War I, the Russian Civil War, the Polish-Russian War, Soviet War, all of these things combined to truly, plus assimilation, plus the emigration of millions to America and so forth. All of this was very evident. All of this meant that Jewish traditional life was departing the lands where for 1,000 years it had existed. And so in addition to that, it was also evident to these scholars that most Jews didn't know anything about their history. They didn't know who they were. Yes, they knew who Zaidi and Bubby were. They knew the folk wisdom that had come down to them through their families. They knew something about the Tsar. They knew something about this. They knew something about that. But there were no academies in the Jewish world that taught the subject of East European Jewish history. There was no Brandeis. There was no Hebrew University. There just weren't places. And so they got together and they said, we have to found an Academy of Higher Jewish Learning in Berlin. And so Shimon Dubnow, Nochem Stiff, Max Weinreich, and other leading scholars were part of this group. And so 3 centers were started, one in Berlin, one in Warsaw, and one in Vilna. Max Weinreich became the director of the Vilna, now Vilnius, Lithuania, then Vilna, Poland, of the Vilna Center. Each of the centers was responsible for a different aspect of Jewish learning: history, sociology, linguistics, folklore, literature, etc. They were supposed to pool the results of their research, but it was the Vilna Center that became the most viable. And the reason for this is that Max Weinreich instituted what became known as the Sammler program, the collecting. And he sent out a call to the Yiddish-speaking Jewish world worldwide. Send us your documents. Send us your plays. Send us your this. Send us family history. Send us photographs of your towns. Send us everything, because there was no archive. How can you study something when you don't have the books and you don't have documents to study, you see? So from 1925 to 1940, until the Nazi invasion, Weinreich and the Vilna Center amassed the largest archive and library in the world of East European Jewish life, documenting it. But here's the thing. What did that mean? You see, what did it mean? When 1 million East European Jews now lived in America, in South America, there were still Jews in Russia, now the Soviet Union. There were Jews in Poland, of course, but what about the Litvaks down in South Africa? What about the Jews who were living in Canada and in England and in France? And so materials came to the YIVO Institute from all of these places. I was astonished when, because I grew up in Chicago. My father always told me about a play that he loved when he was a young man, Kuni Lemo, that took place in Douglas Park. And he was always talking about Kuni Lemo in Douglas Park. Imagine, because of the discoveries that we have made as part of the Edward Blank YIVO Vilna Collections Project in Lithuania, where we discovered 170,000 new documents pertaining to Jewish life. Imagine, one of them is the poster announcing Kuni Lemo in Douglas Park Theater, Yiddish theater. So it's amazing. Stuff from Australia is there, from all over the Jewish world. And so what this also meant was that the archives of YIVO were not just in Yiddish or Polish, but they were in every European language: German, French, English, Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, We have materials in Chinese and Japanese. So it became this kind of global organization, and through the Sammlung project, it became kind of a mass movement. What did that mean? It meant that a YIVO center sprang up in Paris, a YIVO center sprang up in London, a YIVO center sprang up in Chicago, and a YIVO center sprang up in Buenos Aires, among other places. There was one also in Petersburg. And so it became truly a center for the study of Jewish life, but also for the collection of the materials which represented maybe 500 years of Jewish life in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask a little bit about your connection to YIVO and then jump into the story. But you started working with YIVO when you were at New Haven, when you were at Yale Press, correct?
Before that, I started at YIVO, working at YIVO when I was still director of Northwestern University Press in Chicago. Mm. Why? Because I had started, my interests always gravitated, my dissertation is on Henry James, but my interests, my deep interests were always in Eastern Europe and Russia. And so I let Henry James remain Henry James, but I turned my attention to Mayakovsky and Joseph Brodsky and others, and I started a literary magazine called Formations in 1981, the purpose of which was to publish what I thought was the unknown writing of Poland and of Czechoslovakia and Soviet dissidents and so forth. And through that magazine, a Polish artist said, you know, the next time you're in New York, you really have to stop in at the YIVO Institute. There is a man there, his name is Lucien Dobrzycki. He's a very fine scholar, and I think you would find him to be very interesting, and you will learn from him. And so I did. I called Lucien up. This was in 1983, I think. And when I was in New York, I stopped in. And I stopped in every time I was in New York. And frankly, I would stay with Lucien for about 2 hours in his office, and he gave me postgraduate course on East European Jewish history. And I loved Lucien Dobrzycki. He was he was one of these superior human beings. I learned so much from him. And so YIVO was very dear to me through him. And then eventually he said, you know, there's some books that Northwestern could publish. So I started publishing books from YIVO. And then when I moved to Yale, I could simply continue doing that.
Great. So I'm going to ask Jonathan to get into this exciting story, which to me, it almost tells like a movie. And I know Jonathan has some artifacts that he wants to share with us. Before we do that, I want to let everyone know that after we finish with the story, we're going to have the opportunity, if you have questions that you want to ask Jonathan, and you'll be able to ask those questions in one of two ways. So if you open up the chat function, you can simply type your question into the chat. Please let me know, in addition to your question, where you're writing us from. But also, if you raise your virtual hand using the raise hand function, I can bring you in live to the conversation so that you can ask Jonathan your question in real time. I'm giving you a heads up on that now, because when I bring you in live, if you have your camera on, you may end up on the screen as well. And so if you haven't yet gotten that haircut that you've wanted to get for the past month, or you're still in your pajamas, I want to give you that heads up before we bring you into the conversation. Just a little bit more adventure for this webinar. But Jonathan, I want you to tell those who are watching and me this really fascinating story going back to the library in Vilna, and really the two-time rescue and two-time discovery of an incredible treasure trove of artifacts.
One thing to understand is that YIVO was founded in times not that different from our own. They were turbulent times. Lenin dies in 1924. Hitler is on the rise in Germany. And at the same time, they're optimistic times for the Jewish people because of the Minorities Treaty that had been signed after the conclusion of World War I. Jews suddenly had been granted rights. And it was in these conditions of both apprehension and optimism that Weinreich and others set about creating this really magnificent Institute of the Jewish People. In 1939, before the invasion, the Nazis sent emissaries to YIVO in Vilna. We know this because we have documents that show it. And while there, they did an inventory of all of the rooms, all of the items, room by room by room of what YIVO possessed. Because the Nazis, as much as they wanted to annihilate and eradicate Jewish culture of Eastern Europe and really throughout the world, throughout the entire world, they wanted to preserve a certain amount of it that could be showcased in the Museum of the Extinct People they were planning to build in Prague after the war, and also for the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question that was underway in Frankfurt. And so YIVO was identified as the Nazis as a great center where they would be able to seize a tremendous amount of material that would, they thought, help Germans, after the Jews had been destroyed, help them understand why the Jews had to be destroyed. Help them understand why the extermination of Jewish life was a good thing. And our materials were going to help in that. So the Nazis invade Poland in 1939, but because Vilna, providentially, is in the Soviet zone, it has 2 years left to prepare itself and to sort of understand what's going on. And in these 2 years, one of the things that happens is that Max Weinreich is with his son in Denmark giving a series of lectures, and he is told by the people in Vilna, do not come back. And so he is able, through various connections, to book passage to the United States. And in 1940, he begins YIVO New York as the new YIVO Center. But he has no books and no archives. The Nazis come in 1941. The invasion is June 22nd. Within 10 days, they're in Vilna. And at that time, they get to YIVO. They're very excited about this. And then something unplanned happens. And, you know, the Nazis are said to be tremendous organizers, that everything was planned out, Ordnung and Richtung and all the rest of that. It's true, but they made some mistakes. And one of their mistakes was that when they got to the YIVO archive, they realized they couldn't read Yiddish. They couldn't read Polish, for the most part, or Russian, or half of the other languages that our materials were in. And so they, in order to figure out what it was that they should seize and steal from YIVO, they had to get people who could read these languages, you see. So they enlisted a number of slave laborers, Jewish slave laborers from the Vilna ghetto. among whom were Avram Sutzkever, the great poet, and Shmerke Kaczerginski, also a poet, a journalist, an organizer, among others. But Sutzkever was kind of the leader. Sutzkever and Kaczerginski were kind of the leaders of this, and they began the task of sorting the materials for the Nazis. Now, I have a series of pictures of this, photos, which we can show a little bit later. Mm-hmm. And indeed, they did so. But then an argument broke out among the Jews who were doing this work. Is it more in our interests to send materials to Germany where they have a good likelihood of being preserved, even under the hideous conditions of this institute? Or should we sneak them back into the ghetto? Because YIVO, the YIVO building, you have to understand, was outside of the ghetto. Mm-hmm. It wasn't in the ghetto. So they would have to sneak things back into the ghetto and hide them, bury them underground, as was the case with the Ringelblum materials in the Warsaw Ghetto. And Ringelblum, by the way, was a YIVO scholar. The whole Ringelblum archive was undertaken by YIVO scholars because they were part of YIVO in Warsaw. So they decided to do both things. They would continue to give materials to the Nazis, and they would take what they thought were the most precious things and hide them in the Vilna ghetto, which they did do. Now, the stuff that was sent to Frankfurt by the Nazis was probably 70% of what was saved. But the 30% that was put in the Vilna ghetto was also saved. And a lot of it is exactly extremely precious, very, very precious materials. And the Nazis didn't know anything about this. And the stories about the way that they took this stuff out of the YIVO building, there are stories about Shmerke Kaczerginski wrapping a Torah scroll around his body and putting on his shirt. So he looked like a kind of a blimp when he walked out, and he was certain that he was going to be stopped by the guard and that he would be shot immediately. And by chance, absolute accident, the guard looked the other way and he went in. But they would hide things in their pants, in their shoes, in their shirts. It was really quite an extraordinary and very, very heroic effort to save what? To save Jewish culture. To save this record of our civilization at a time when people were dying of starvation, at a time when the whole population was doomed because something around 95 to 98% of Lithuanian Jewry was murdered by the Nazis. It's one of the highest rates of murder in the Holocaust. So after the war, the US Army finds the material outside of Frankfurt. It was in a warehouse in, not far from Frankfurt. And they look it over, and as luck would have it, the head of the US Army Division for the Recovery of Jewish Property from Eastern Europe was a man by the name of Seymour Pomerantz, who was a member of YIVO in Chicago. And so he immediately recognized what these materials were. And he called Max Weinreich up and He said, you know, in 1946, we found your materials. We found your books. I can only imagine what that must have been like for Max Weinreich. He had no idea about the other stuff that was still in Vilnius, what had become of it. So many of his friends, colleagues, family had been murdered. But these materials were saved. And so thanks to the Manischewitz brothers and the US Army, these things were sent to YIVO in New York. And it's approximately 900,000 documents and about 15,000 books were part of this. So it was a very, very significant collection.
It's an incredible story.
It's not over. because Kaczerginski and Sutzkever became partisans during the war. They were still in Lithuania, and they stayed in they escaped the Vilna ghetto, became partisans, and then survived in the Soviet side until the Soviet Union liberated Vilnius. Mm-hmm. And within 2 weeks of the liberation of Vilnius, the smoke had just barely risen from all the rubble. Sutzkever was back searching for all of the lost materials. The YIVO building was bombed, and unfortunately, the upper story of the YIVO building was one hiding place. However, in the ghetto itself, where materials were buried, they found a great deal. And he literally went house to house with a pushcart and friends, collecting stuff. And also materials that they had given to friendly non-Jews, Poles or Lithuanians, because as much as the Lithuanians did horrible things, terrible, terrible cruelty, humiliation, humiliating things to their Jewish neighbors, there were many Lithuanians who helped. There are, I think, something like 900 or maybe 1,000 righteous Gentiles from Lithuania, which is astounding when you think of the destruction of the Jewish community there. It's one of the highest percentages of righteous Gentiles of any country in the world. I think maybe equal to that in Poland. In any case, after Kaczerginski and Sutzkever collected as much as they possibly could and found as much as they possibly could in the ruins of the Vilna ghetto, they decided, because it was now again a period of some hopefulness, the Nazis were gone, the Soviets hadn't yet come. It's a little bit like that scene in Grossman's film, The Commissar, where the guy is up on the roof and he's singing a nice song, and the commissar says to him, "What are you singing about? It's the Civil War." He says, "Oh, for a Jew, it couldn't be a better moment. The whites have gone and the reds haven't come yet." Mm-hmm. This is when, and that's kind of like that moment where they could breathe again. And in this moment where they could breathe, they decided to create a new Jewish museum of Vilnius and put these materials there. And indeed, they got permission to do so, and they did it. And then in 1948, Stalin gave the order, because this was now the beginning of the anti-Jewish, anti-cosmopolitan campaign throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. He gave the order to destroy every remnant of Jewish cultural life in Eastern Europe, which is why there's so little. Go to Poland today, go to Belarus, go to Russia. What do you find? Almost nothing, nothing. You know, there's some synagogues there, so, you know, but my God, what was lost is incomprehensible. And this trove of material, maybe close to 500,000 additional documents and thousands of books, would have been lost as well, because the order was given to pulp it all, send it to the pulping mill.
Mm-hmm.
Kaczerginski and Sutzkever were informed by friends that they were going to be arrested and shot. And so they quickly fled, and they had no idea what happened. In the midst of this chaos, disorganization, and really terror, a Lithuanian librarian by the name of Antanas Ulpis, who was not Jewish, maybe knew a tiny bit of Yiddish, a little, maybe a couple of words of Hebrew or something. He took it upon himself to save this material. There are people like this. There are decent, good people. And this was one of them, a decent, good man who, as his son has said to me, who lived, I think may still do, in New Jersey, said to me when we spoke about his father, he said he was just a very humane man. He didn't recognize the differences among people. He only recognized that people were people. And he saved this because he was aware of all of the horrible things that had been inflicted on his friends, his Jewish friends, on the Jewish community. And he felt it his responsibility to save it. And so he did so, risking his life for no reward. He didn't immediately go to the New York Times or Spielberg or anybody, and nothing. But he organized with a small group of friends a posse with trucks, and they go to the pulping mill, and they take the stuff off the dock of the pulping mill, and they put it in trucks, and they then hide it in the basement, not in the basement, but among a variety of other things, of the Church of St. George, which had been converted by the Soviets from being a church into what was called the Lithuanian Book Chamber. The Lithuanian Book Chamber was going to be the Lithuanian National Library. So this was the way the Soviets did things. They took synagogues, just like the Nazis. They took synagogues and made them into horse stables. They took churches, made them into libraries. And excuse me. He put all these materials in piles all over, but he did something else as well. He didn't mark them so that no one could find them. And he intermixed everything. Very clever. So that if some government inspector were walking through, he wouldn't know what he was looking at. And none of the other librarians knew what this stuff was. But he had a couple young acolytes. And as one of them said in an interview, when Opus was walking through the church and showing him stuff, and all of a sudden they came to an unmarked pile of manuscripts and books, and the young man says to him, "What are these, Dr. Opus?" And Opus said, "Those are the Jewish materials. Now you have seen them, and now you forget them." And this was a very carefully guarded secret that he had them. But one day, his son, the same fellow who now lives in New Jersey, said to me that as a little boy, he came with his father to the church, and there's the organ. So as a little boy, he runs to the organ, he starts pressing all the keys and the pedals and everything else, and no sound comes out, and his father is laughing at him. And the little boy can't figure out what the problem is. And the father says, "Look in the bellows." And so the little boy looks in the bellows, and there are Jewish manuscripts and books packed inside. So to me, the symbolism of the bellows, of the organ, of the church being filled with Jewish words, Jewish letters, essentially the breath of our people, is quite extraordinary. Mm-hmm. In any case, there those materials stayed. Ulpis died in the 80s and never knew what happened to it and never told anybody. But in 1989, when the Soviet Union begins to crumble, and in 1991, when it collapses, a inventory of the church is made, and the Lithuanians discover all of this Jewish material. And so they let us know in New York that they had found this. And then from 1991 to 2014, there ensued a long and protracted period of negotiations about who owned it and where it should be, and this and that and the other thing. And over all this time, the stuff just stayed there in dank and inadequate conditions, stayed there deteriorating. And so when I got there, I started at YIVO in 2009, and when I got there in 2011 and I looked at this material, I started to think of ways by which we could save it, ways by which it might be possible to bring these materials that nobody really had seen for all of these years back into the community of scholars and the general public. And so that's how the project.
Can we look at some of the artifacts right
Sure.
here?
Yeah, let's do that.
Bring those up on the screen, and you can let everyone else know what we're looking at.
So this is the original YIVO building in Vilnius. You can see it was a modern building, a beautiful building. Everyone was extremely proud of it. And then if we go to the next slide, that's what it looked like after the war. And you can see the top of it was bombed out. In the lower left-hand corner is Avram Sutzkever. And you see that May 1946. This is just within weeks of the Nazis being expelled from Vilnius. I'm sorry, this is right after the war. There's another of July 1945. But you see in all of the rubble around the building, and in that rubble are the burned fragments of documents and books. And so Sutzkever and a colleague collected a lot of these fragments, put them in boxes and sent them to New York City. And we have these in the YIVO Institute now, the fragments of the burnt documents. But let's go on. Now, that building that you just saw, this is where the space it now inhabits. That is to say, not the building, not the gray building behind, but that space in the center, that empty space. Mm-hmm. And when I first saw this, I thought, my God, what a symbol of Jewish life of Eastern Europe. And in our own cultural memory, it has become this empty space. This erasure was so complete, as it was for many American Jews as well. How much do we really know about that life? And so I took this photo just to remind me of the empty space that there really is in our consciousness, as well as on the streets of Vilnius. Now, however, last summer, a plaque was installed on the wall of that gray building saying that hereabouts stood the YIVO Institute from 1928 when the building was built to 1941. So this is a picture of Sutzkever with his back turned, and Kaczorginski sorting books in the YIVO Institute for shipment to Germany. And you can see that they're all piled up. And this is evidence of what they were doing. And this is the books at the Vilna train depot that are going to, that are coming off of the lorry. And those cartons that you see are going to be put on trains and shipped to Frankfurt. This is those books that you saw in YIVO being sorted by Kaczorginski and Sutzkever, that you saw in boxes at the depot, now packed and shipped and sent to New York City in 1947 with the help of the US military and the Manischewitz brothers, who are in this picture. This was their best gefilte fish ever. So when we started looking at the materials that exist in, I mean, this is why this project was so important. When I first saw the materials in the Lithuanian Central State Archives, this was the condition that much of them were in. They were still pasted together. They were crinkled, they were torn. We estimated that of the original batch of 135,000 documents, over 65,000 needed urgent conservation. And you can't just pull these documents apart and start fixing them. You have to be able to read them. You have to know if this fragment goes here, this fragment goes there. And indeed, what we have discovered is that there are fragments of materials among these documents that are like the afikomen to documents that we have in New York City. So we are truly putting the afikomen back together.
And you have a team of Yiddishists that are looking at these?
We have a team of scholars in Lithuania who are doing this work. And by the way, the work is almost entirely complete in the Lithuanian Central State Archives. It is complete there. And work is now going on the new discoveries that were made in 2017. And then we have a team of scholars here. We need scholars who can read Yiddish, who can read Ukrainian, who can read Polish, who can read German, who can read Russian. And so we have a specialist in different languages. We have a team of 5 conservationists in our offices in New York City working specifically on this, and conserving these documents in Lithuania is being done by the Lithuanian National Library and by the Lithuanian Central State Archives.
So let's keep looking through these, because I want to leave some time to share you with everybody else.
So this is one of the documents that we found in Lithuania. This was among the new discoveries. And when I say new discoveries, what I mean is that we thought that everything had been discovered in 1991, and that was not the case. In 2015, I was told to come to the Wróblewski Library. They had something they would like to show me. And so I go there, and there's a long desk, and there's the director of the library at one end, and she says to me, "Why don't you look through the boxes?" I start looking through the boxes. They're YIVO documents. And I say to her, "How long have you had these?" She said, "Since 1946. I said, "And what have you been doing with them since 1946? She said, "We were waiting." I said, "Well, what were you waiting for?" She said, "We were waiting for you." And this is an honest to God true story. And so it turns out there were about 20,000 documents that Ulpis sent from the Lithuanian National Library, of which he was the head, to the Wróblewski Library, obviously to hide them in yet another place. But what we didn't know was that yet another cache of 170 to 200,000 additional documents was to be found in the Lithuanian National Library that nobody knew anything about. And in 2017, they were found. And this was among them. And this shows you why it is so important to look at these materials. This is an astronomical manuscript from 1751.
Wow, and remarkably well preserved.
Remarkably well preserved.
Amazing.
And it is from Alsace in northeastern France. And it was sent to Vilna. What is it about? It's about astronomy in 1751. And the interior of this has magnificent drawings and astrological projections of all kinds. And, you know, it's just, yes, beautifully preserved, immensely important for understanding what Jewish life really was in those lands. This is another kind of a manuscript. It's a notebook from the Telz Yeshiva, Musar Shmuzin, by the head of the Telz Yeshiva. Now, the Telz Yeshiva also picked up and left and is now in Cleveland, United States. But this is a collection of sermons, of talks that were given in 1917 in Yiddish.
Let's finish with this one, and then we'll go to questions, because this one I know is fascinating.
Yes, it is. It's extraordinary, really, because it helps us see, again, why these documents are so important. It's an agreement between the water carriers, which is the lowest of the low on the social hierarchy, with the Ramailis Yeshiva from 1857. It's a contract. The water carriers will donate a Torah scroll to the yeshiva and will raise funds to purchase a set of Talmud if the yeshiva will designate a room for the water carriers to hold services on Sabbaths and holidays rent-free. So what does it show us? It shows us, A, that the water carriers, though the lowest of the low in terms of social, economic hierarchy, had aspirations to pray in the best synagogue in Vilnius, the best yeshiva, and that in order to do so, they make a contract. They don't just shake a hand, they don't just lobby, they have a contract, 1857. There's every reason to believe that the contract was fulfilled on both sides. So these documents give us insight into how things actually worked. Who were these people who wanted an astronomical manuscript in 1751? Who were these water carriers with their aspirations? Who were these pious students listening to these talks? They're us. They're us. We are their descendants. They are us. Their ambition was no different from ours.
Right.
And this is a very important thing. In my family, I don't know about yours or others, in my family, the old country was the old country, forget it. It was a land of humiliation, a land of degradation, a land of endless shame and ridicule. We didn't talk about it. Nobody talked about it. But there's a lot to talk about because we wouldn't be who we are without it.
So this is such a fascinating story. I know that I have a bunch of questions, but I want to share this space with those who are watching as well. And so I want to invite you once again to raise your virtual hand or to type a question into the chat feature. We already have a question. This is from Lula Yablachnik, and she says, how did the Nazis identify the contents of the rooms at YIVO in their pre-war, pre-invasion cataloging visit? They couldn't read Yiddish or Polish or Russian then either, right?
Right. Well, there was a man, his name was Paul, And he did. He could. He could read Hebrew. He could read Yiddish. He studied in Palestine. He was a Jewish. He was a Jewish scholar. They had many Jewish scholars, but when the invasion came, you know, the majority of German soldiers who were in charge of the operation couldn't read it. Mm-hmm. But yes, when the inventory was done, they had people who, specialists, who were able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Great. So here is Harriet. Harriet, I'm going to unmute you. Harriet, do you have a question for Jonathan?
Well, it's not so much a question. First, I want to thank you, Jonathan, so much
Mm-hmm.
for your enthusiastic presentation, but wondering whether or not you are familiar with David E. Fishman's book, The Book Smugglers, Partisans, yeah. Poets, and the Race to Save Treasures from the Nazis. Our book group, I'm in Westport, Connecticut, mm-hmm. A book group at Temple Israel read that this past year as part of our selection. And you have done such a wonderful, I mean, you've embellished what was in the book, but it's a wonderful text. It's called The Book Smugglers.
Yes.
And David E. Fishman, he's a historian.
David
well,
is
thank you, Harriet.
David wrote that book at YIVO, by the way. And yes, we had a program for him. It's a very fine book, and thank you I should have pointed that out as well. Thank you.
So I've brought my friend Art into the conversation. I'm going to ask him to unmute himself. Art, we're ready for your question as soon as you're unmuted.
Am I unmuted now?
There you are. We can hear you, Art.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Professor Brandt, and hello, Harriet. And David, I'm glad that you're recognizing the importance of Westport to this conversation. Have any, among the discoveries, have there been works of literature or art or music that have been uncovered as a result of your efforts?
Oh, yes, much, much. We're working right now on a translation, if you can imagine this, of a science fiction novel set on Mars that was written in 1941, apparently in the Vilna Ghetto. And the manuscript was preserved. And it's by a noted Yiddish writer. And there are numerous things like that. What I didn't show, we don't have time to show, is that among the discoveries were 11 notebooks of Chaim Grada's writings, pre-war writings, totally lost, totally forgotten about. Nobody knew what this stuff was. Here, yes, this is what they look like. These are 5 notebooks. There were 11 altogether. And we have just started looking through them. So this is a major, I mean, this is truly a major literary find. But in addition, Avram Sutzkever left a book of his own poetry in the ghetto. After the war, this notebook was found by Sutzkever. He put it in the museum, and it was discovered among the materials that were hidden in the National Library of Israel. So in addition, some 55,000 pages of new materials pertaining to Yiddish theater and operettas has been found. So yes, in answer to your question, quite a bit. And as soon as we digitize everything and get everything in shape, people will be, through the Edward Blank project, all of this will be online, and people will be able to read it on their cell phones wherever they happen to be, in Buenos Aires, in Moscow, in Tokyo, or in Pago Pago.
Hey, Claire, we're looking at you in your living room. How are you?
Fine, thank you. I'm calling from Rockville, Maryland, but we used to live in Fairfield. Just a question concerning whether YIVO ever works in conjunction with the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst,
Mhm.
because I think each organization might have much to offer to each other.
Yes, we do work with
Thank you,
them.
Claire.
And right at the moment, we are working with them to digitize the totality of Yiddish writing. It's going to be the entirety of Yiddish writing, extant Yiddish writing, writing in the Yiddish language, and it's going to be online. To put it into perspective, YIVO has 44,000 individual volumes written in the Yiddish language. The National Yiddish Book Center has about, I think, 14 to 18,000. And so they're going to do part of the project, and we're going to do the other part of the project. And we're working also with the National Library of Israel on doing this. Again, it will be something that is free and open to the public.
We have time for just a couple more questions. Ari wants to know, Ari's in White Plains. He wants to know, have there been any discoveries of genealogical records from the shtetls?
That's a good question. There are Landsmannschaften books that contain genealogical materials. And YIVO has an enormous collection of these. And as far as I know, there have been such books discovered as part of this project.
And the last question will go to Stacy, who asks, would you share what's to you the most surprising document that you found in these hidden troves?
You know, I ask that to every scholar, and every scholar comes up with something different. I know to David Fishman, we were talking about David, he thought that contract between the water carriers and the Ramilus Yeshiva was the most amazing document that he could find. But then we found the Sutzkever notebooks, and that became the most amazing document. And then we found the Grada, and that became the most amazing. And, you know, the way archives work is that all these pieces get put together into a whole. It is the whole that can tell us the story. So I hesitate to say what is the most amazing. We have materials from the Nazi high command, which are pretty stunning as well. It's a treasure. Let me put it this way. We have, the Jewish people has a treasure, a great treasure. This treasure doesn't exist anywhere else on earth, not in Poland, not in England, not in America, except at YIVO, not in Russia. When I was in Russia, and the head of the Jewish museum there very proudly told me that he had 5,000 original artifacts. And I said to him, you know, Mr. Connor, this is really great. YIVO has 23 million. And he couldn't believe it. He thought I was lying. Then he did some research, he found out I wasn't lying, and he came to America to have a look. But this is a great treasure. And I feel that it's my responsibility to let people know that we have this. These are our crown jewels.
Right. So if you're in your basement and there's a loose floorboard and you pull it up and you find a box underneath and you open it up and it's in a language that you don't quite understand but looks like Yiddish, give Jonathan a call.
Absolutely.
There may be the missing piece of the afikoman, as he said, that they're looking to put together. Jonathan, in our final minute, for those who are not far away from New York or another YIVO facility who might be interested in visiting, what's the way to, how can anyone connect with what's going on there, either in person or online?
Well, the best thing to do is go to our website, yivo.org. It's very simple. Just go to yivo.org. We have wonderful classes online for free right now. of all sorts. One on Jewish food that has over 10,000 people around the world tuning in to listen to it. We've got online chats going on right now. We have lectures on YouTube. We have all kinds of things that one can find today during this crisis. When we reopen, give us a call, send me an email. I'd be happy to arrange, as I was saying to David earlier, I would be happy to arrange a private tour for a group from Fairfield, if you would like to arrange it, to show you some of these extraordinary things so you can look at them. We're creating an online museum that is based on one of these documents, the autobiography of a little girl who was 13 years old in 1932. And we assumed that she had died in the Holocaust. But this autobiography has a picture of her on the cover. And the New York Times took a photo of it when they did a story about this autobiography, put it on the cover of the culture section of the New York Times. And the next day, I got a call from this 13-year-old's son, now living in Los Angeles, to tell me that Beba Epstein was his mother.
So, Jonathan, I want to thank you not only for the past hour, but for the past years, both of your professional life and everything that YIVO has done for decades. We were talking before the broadcast started about those who are interested in Yiddish, and you said there's a lot of young people in Yiddish who are interested in Yiddish. They're not Jewish, but they look at Yiddish as part of an indigenous culture. And so for the work that you've done to help preserve our indigenous culture, our stories, we're tremendously indebted to you and the YIVO Institute. So thank you for sharing just one really exciting part of it. And we're anxious to hear about the next big discovery, and we'll be sure to bring you back. Great.
Well, we'll let you know. And thank you so much for this opportunity. I've really enjoyed it and very grateful.
Me too. Stay healthy. Have a great day. Take care. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Thank you.